Hi, I'm Praveen Swami, and we're starting the first in a series of deep dives at The Print into geopolitics. This one's about how the Middle East got its borders and why those borders today mark some of the most bloody battlefields in the world. The Middle East isn't a phrase anyone living in the region ever used about themselves. General T.E. Gordon, writing in 1900, said its most important parts were Iran and Afghanistan. But he didn't cast light on where this whole thing called the Middle East might begin or end. The American naval strategist Alfred Mahan, one of the most famous and influential voices, used the phrase 2 years later, discussing Russian influence in Tehran. And the foreign editor of the venerable Times of London, Valentine Chirol, wrote in 1902 that the Middle East meant, and I quote, those regions of Asia which extend to the borders of India or command the approaches to India. And that tells you just why the Middle East was and is important. It opens the gates between Europe and the Far East. So how did the Middle East become characterized by long, straight borders cutting through deserts, mountains, and communities? How did its many nation states come into being? Is the Maghreb in North Africa part of the Middle East? Is Iran, Shia, Persian-speaking, properly a part of the Middle East or Central Asia? And Turkey? There are good arguments for and against any of those propositions, and I'm going to try and talk you through them today. 3 parts of the Middle East are particularly important today because of the explosion of violence they're seeing. One, of course, I don't have to tell you about. Israel, Palestine. There'll be more of this later in the video, but Israel came into being after the Second World War as an independent nation state. At the time, there was to be a separate Palestinian territory, but a succession of wars saw Israel grab chunks of what we today call the West Bank and Gaza. The second area that's really important is to the north of Israel. That's Lebanon and Syria. Lebanon was created by French colonialism along with Syria. And the straight Syrian borders you see, together with its borders with Iraq, demarcated the difference between French colonial influence and British colonial influence in Mesopotamia. These were just straight lines through the desert. The third and most important area, of course, is Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf. Like much of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia was made up of loose tribal confederations who ruled under an imperial umbrella. For many centuries, Saudi Arabia, or what we today call Saudi Arabia, was a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire based out of Istanbul. The Ottomans profited from the pilgrim trade to Mecca and in turn derived religious legitimacy from being the custodians of the holy shrines. After the First World War, we'll see the British encouraged rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, and the Saudi state, or what we later came to call the Saudi Arabian state, was born as the result of an alliance between the most powerful of the tribal confederations and the clergy. Between the First and the Second World War, there was a frantic pace of exploration across the Middle East. Now remember, many American oil magnates were quite content with the vast finds of oil that had already been made in the continental United States, and unlike the British, weren't initially very keen to be looking all the way at the Middle East. But some visionary oil tycoons like J. Paul Getty surveyed the relative price of oil that they could extract in the Middle East after paying royalties to local rulers and what it cost them to drill in the United States itself. The margin was huge. J. Paul Getty famously sent a geologist to fly in the region between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and prospect for oil. The geologist came back with favorable reports, and Getty negotiated the basis of a deal that for a considerable length of time made him the richest man in the world. Getty then pioneered the use of very large tankers to ferry oil from Saudi Arabia to refineries and on to markets across the world. Even though the United States had plenty of its own oil and today is the world's largest producer, its control of Middle East oil gave it geopolitical power. Through its control through proxy kings, it could decide the price of oil and thus maintained a chokehold on industry and energy across the world. To understand how the Middle East got the way it did involves drilling deep into the history of one of the world's most complex regions and the forces that shaped it. Islam? No. Arabic? No. Imperialism. In the beginning was Napoleon. So starts the famous historian Thomas Nipperday's History of the Making of Modern Germany. This might seem a bit strange, but it's also true of the Middle East. Till 1798, the Middle East was a loosely governed system of territories centered on the Ottoman Empire, that is, the Empire of Turkey. The region was mainly Arabic-speaking, but it was a multi-ethnic melting pot of Iranians, Kurds, Turkic peoples, Africans. Egypt, its most strategically vital hub, and also one of its great river valley civilizations like India, was ruled by elites of the Mamluk dynasty. France's new emperor Napoleon had clear motives for seeking to seize control of Egypt. France was not ready to take England head-on, but Napoleon hoped to seize a vital trading hub to India and create a kind of double port connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. So the idea of the Suez Canal was, of course, a long way away. This double port would allow France to strengthen its alliance with Tipu Sultan, the king of Mysore, and other Indian princes who were fighting the English. For his soldiers, Napoleon had a famous message. Treat them as you treated the Jews, the Italians, respect their muftis and their imams as you respected their rabbis and bishops. Have the same tolerance for the ceremonies prescribed by the Quran for their mosques as you had for the convents and for the synagogues, for the religion of Moses and that of Jesus Christ. The Roman legions used to protect all religions. Egypt, though, proved less than willing to swap their old masters, the Ottomans, for the new ones, that is, the French. Ferocious battles followed, with England siding with local elites and Ottoman forces. Finally, in 1801, France was compelled to surrender, and its troops were repatriated home on English ships. The impact of colonialism was to be deep, though. From the printing press to methods of warfare and administration, the French introduced new technologies and a strategic culture that had a lasting impact. Little debate can exist on the biggest fallout of the French campaign. French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps obtained a concession from Said Pasha, the ruler of Egypt and Sudan, to build the Suez Canal in 1854. England actually resisted the idea of a waterway open to all shipping, preferring a train route where the Suez Canal runs and its existing domination of the longer journey around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. Eventually, though, a private sector consortium led by the French constructed the canal. The canal was declared a neutral zone in 1888 after Egypt was occupied by England at the request of the Khedive Tawfiq, who was facing a revolt against his rule. Alfred Mahan, the strategist I told you about, argued in 1902 that England could maintain control over the routes to India through a network of relationships with minor local rulers, and especially solidified trade and diplomatic relations with Persia and Mesopotamia. Leaving aside the route to India, though, the vast regions of the Middle East remained something of an imperial backwater. The real profits were to be made in resource-rich parts of Asia, like India and Africa, it seemed, not in the deserts of Mesopotamia. Germany soon joined the efforts of other European powers to seize territory in Africa and Asia. A figure central to German unification in 1871, Otto von Bismarck, had earlier scoffed at the idea of colonies, saying it would be like, and I quote, a poor Polish nobleman buying silks and sables when he needed shirts. Germany was then a poor power compared to Europe, other great countries like France and Britain. In just 1884-1885, though, Germany took over what is today Namibia, Togo, Cameroon, and Tanzania. The Germans, historian Karel Blackshire-Bellet writes, were prodigious railway line builders and created a whole amount of infrastructure in Africa, far outstripping their European counterparts. So you have an enormous amount of railway activity, the new Suez Canal being built, trade to India and southern Africa. But how do you fix where the borders between the great European powers lay? Even as the First World War brought this race for imperial power to a head, France and the United Kingdom were engaged in a series of complicated negotiations to give political shape to the Middle East. In 1915, the Sharif of Mecca and Britain's High Commissioner to Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, does that name sound familiar? From the McMahon line that separates India and China? Well, the same McMahon exchanged a series of 10 letters appearing to promise Arab independence in return for a revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which was allied with the Germans. How did the British choose a partner to govern Transjordan, the area across the Jordan River? Well, like a lot of tribal federations, the Hashemite kings considered themselves or marketed themselves as direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Being a direct descendant of the Prophet isn't actually a necessary qualification to rule, but many Middle Eastern clan leaders or tribal leaders have claimed such descent as it gives them theological legitimacy. The Ottomans notably made this claim because they saw themselves as caliphs or rulers of the entire Muslim Ummah or Muslim nation. And to occupy that position, you do indeed need to be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Anyway, the Hashemites were picked not because of their theological credentials, but because of their willingness to work with the British and overthrow Ottoman authority in the region. In return, they got their country. The Hashemites, the dynasty which today rules Jordan, were promised independence for all territories east of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. The Hashemites weren't, however, the only ones the British were talking to. In 1916, the diplomats Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, with the assent of Russia and Italy, came to an agreement drawing up the so-called Sykes-Picot line, which divided the Middle East into British and French zones of influence. Even though the Sykes-Picot agreement has become a symbol of imperial perfidy, which you'll have seen if you at all look at the internet debates around the Middle East, the documents show colonial authorities weren't actually primarily interested in drawing up borders. Historian Francesco Mazzucatelli explains. Though there was a vague map attached to the correspondence, the real objective was, and I quote, the status of major ports and railroads. seems to highlight that the primary concern of the respective imperial governments, France and Britain, was to ensure the free flow of goods across the Middle East and to grant the possibility of future economic exploitation of the region, to prevent any third party from becoming a possible competitor in local markets as Germany had done. To make things even more complicated, the British issued a declaration in 1917 called the Balfour Declaration. This committed to, and I quote, the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a promise that seemed irreconcilable with the agreements made both with the Sharifs and with the French. Large-scale immigration from Europe to what is now Israel would not begin until after the Holocaust and the great tragedy of the Second World War. And few officials pondered the impact large-scale Jewish migration might have on local Arabs. Efforts by colonial powers to agree on borders after the First World War led nowhere. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George met in 1919 to try and iron out the issues, only to discover they could not agree on how to divide Syria and Palestine. For their part, the United States, then led by President Woodrow Wilson, insisted self-determination in some form should guide the creation of the new nation-states of the Middle East. Obviously, the French and the British, who had bigger colonial fish to fry, weren't very keen about this whole self-determination business. All the way up to September 1932, the new League of Nations, the precursor to today's United Nations, continued to discuss the demarcation of the frontier in northern Mesopotamia, that's between Iraq and Syria, and Turkey. These regions were not empty boxes of sand, obviously, and the peoples who lived in them were communities with overlapping sovereignties and porous borders. To the League of Nations, though, it didn't seem critically important exactly where a line was to be drawn between nomadic populations. Fences were meant to stop trafficking and gun running, not to assert the territorial sovereignty of Middle Eastern states. After all, those Middle Eastern states simply didn't exist. Then something would happen that changed the whole game. The big development that transformed and created the Middle East wasn't the drawing of lines across the sand. It was what was discovered under it. In 1911, the geologist Georges Bernard Renaud made the first major finds of oil in Iran. So this initial discovery in 1911 was followed by a great deal of exploration and capped by the Americans over 2 decades with the discovery of huge oil fields in Dammam in Saudi Arabia. In 1928, several American, British and French oil companies signed an agreement carving up the oil fields of the erstwhile Ottoman Empire. For many countries across the Middle East, oil was their destiny, or if you prefer, their ugly fate. In Whitehall, British diplomats had long debated exactly how much on-ground influence they should expend on this desert region. Following the discovery of the oil fields of Kirkuk in Iraq and Mosul, there was no longer any doubt in any British bureaucrat's mind. Even though the role of Middle East oil in the Second World War was quite limited because there were great oil fields coming from the Caribbean and elsewhere, the big imperial powers understood the future significance. In 1944, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt drew, and I quote, a rough sketch of the Middle East for British Ambassador Edward Wood. Persian oil, he told the ambassador, is yours. We share the oil of Iraq and Kuwait. As for Saudi Arabian oil, it is ours. The famous meeting of the Saudi king Abdul Aziz ibn Saud and the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt aboard the USS Quincy on 14 February 1945 marks the formal establishment of a policy that continues to this day. It can be summarized as an exchange of American military and diplomatic protection against the secure flow of Saudi oil through Aramco and other American oil companies, Saudi oil companies. Little imagination is needed to see that this is not a robust basis for the making of nation states, obviously. Modern nation states, systems, polities are supposed to be founded on some kind of popular consensus. As the scholar Yoel Guzansky has noted, the idea of a nation state with clear borders was unknown in the Persian Gulf, outside of Oman, which was a kingdom, and the long-standing empire of Iran. Even their borders were made up of loose lines between tribes and shifting nomads. The straight borders running through deserts we see on the map today were drawn by the United Kingdom, which conducted the foreign policy of these emirates along vague and temporary marks like, quote, the southernmost palm tree. Elsewhere in the region, tribal boundaries or geographical features help provide a slightly more organic basis to border formation. But many borderlands have remained fraught. Territorial conflicts rage, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but between the Kurds perched along the borders in Turkey and Iraq to the Sahel, where Moroccan sovereignty is contested. The Arab scholar Ghassan Salameh perceptively notes that sometimes purely ideological categories hardly fit the reality of current nation states. The most politically effective myths, Pan-Arabism, Islamic Ummah, etc., thus recur without state political apparatuses to embody them. Present Middle Eastern states, on the other hand, often find themselves derived of the kinds of powerful national stories or myths, if you prefer, which can be theirs alone. A new generation of Middle Eastern leaders are now struggling to address the strange vacuum left behind by history. How these conflicts will finally play out requires a talent for astrology I don't have. But this much is clear. The making of the Middle East hasn't been ended by the long lines drawn up by colonialism and the great powers. It's a process that's still underway and will ultimately be drawn after a great deal of bloodshed and contestation. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor at The Print. Thank you for joining me in the first of this series of deep dives into geopolitics, this one on how the Middle East got its borders.